Welcome everyone to our webinar on Startup 101, Ensuring Your Safe is Safe. My name is Sian McLachlan and I am a practice leader in LegalVision's corporate team. I'm joined today by my colleague, David Kerr, who is a practice leader also in our corporate team. Before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping items. So you will receive the recording and slides in your email following the webinar. So no need to take detailed notes today, or in case you miss anything, it will be in your inbox afterwards. Please submit questions in the chat box. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and so happy to answer any questions you may have on anything talked about today. Also, please complete the feedback survey after the webinar. We'd love to know how you found the content today. Also, all attendees are eligible to receive a free consultation with us to discuss how we can help you with any of your contracts or any of your legal needs. To request your free consultation, please provide us with your contact details in the survey that appears at the end of the webinar. If you don't put your contact details in there, we won't be able to offer you that free consultation. So today we will be discussing, first of all, what is a safe? Secondly, other forms of capital raising. Thirdly, the trigger events for safes. Fourth, the conversion prices. Fifth, recent changes that we've seen in safes. And finally, we will have a Q&A at the end. So again, if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat box during the webinar and we will answer them at the end. Now we will speak about safes. So first of all, what is a safe? So a safe is a way for a company to raise money. Under a safe, an investor agrees to make a cash payment to the company, which is its investment. The amount of the cash payment is the invested amount. So in exchange for the safe, the company gives the investor the right to convert the invested amount into shares when a pre-agreed trigger event occurs. So the most common form of trigger event is usually a capital raise. So this is the one that the investors in the company are aiming towards. So the trigger event will occur immediately prior to issuing the shares in that capital raise round. And so that's important to note because it means the safe holder, their shares that they will acquire through the safe, they'll then be diluted through the shares that are issued as part of that capital raise round. So when I'm talking to my clients about safes, I usually explain that the easiest way to think about them is that it's a convertible note, but without the obligation to repay. And for those of you not yet across convertible notes, we will be going into what that means in a little later on. So historically, if the company never undertakes a capital raise after it has issued the safe will never convert. However, as we will talk about, that has changed from time to time more recently. For those of you wondering, both from the investor perspective and from the company perspective, how it's treated for accounting purposes, safes are usually treated as a debt instrument. And that's because in the safe, there is usually a provision which says if the company goes insolvent, there is an obligation to for the company to repay the safe, so the investor can basically claim its invested amount back if the company has gone insolvent. So the investor does have the right to stand as a creditor of the company in the case of the company's insolvency usually. David will now talk about how safe is different from other forms of capital raising, specifically equity.
Thanks, Sian. Look, I think one of the best ways to understand how a safe can improve your capital raising chances, it's really important to understand what the key differences are compared to the most traditional form of capital raising, which is equity. That is the company raising money and issuing shares at the time the money is raised. One of the most difficult conversations that founders tell us all the time that they have with investors is, how much is my company worth right now? This is significantly more difficult in early stage companies where they're pre-revenue, pre-product, and they don't even know where to start. So one of the biggest benefits of a safe is you can move the valuation conversation down the road. As Sian mentioned before, the whole purpose of a safe is to take investment now with a promise to investors that they will get shares in the future. So it means we don't have to have the valuation conversation now, and we can take on investment and go away and build a company. And at some point in the future, when things are more clear, we can discuss valuation on conversion. One of the things that flows on from this is it shortens negotiations. Not only do we have to have the valuation we don't have to have the valuation negotiations, the documents of themselves are also a lot more simple, hence the name Simple Agreement for Future Equity. Generally speaking, safes have very limited commercial terms. There is a discount rate and an investment amount, and sometimes there's a valuation cap. So you can usually negotiate a safe quite quickly for those who are familiar with safes. As we'll discuss later in this webinar, whether it's as simple as it used to be may change. However, they are still very simple compared to an equity round. It is important to understand that unlike other forms of capital raising, safes don't have a term. It's not, except if there's changes, and a requirement where I take on investment, and if things don't happen in a specific certain time frame, then we have to unwind that investment. It really is sign the safe, take the money, and go away and come. Now, capital raising through equity is similar, only that subscription agreements often do have requirements that certain things have to happen before investor will give you your money, and if they don't happen by an agreed time frame, they can often walk away, though once the subscription in an equity round completes, then there's usually no unwinding that subscription. Now, as discussed, the documents really are the safe agreement themselves. In slightly more complicated safe rounds, especially VC-led ones, there will sometimes be a side letter, but it is nowhere near as extensive as an equity round where there will always be the subscription agreement, the shareholders agreement, your constitution, and all the documents that follow on from there. So some of the key things to remember: we can move the valuation conversation down the road, we can negotiate them quite quickly, and the documentation is rather simple. So I'll hand back over to Sian, who can discuss some of the comparisons with convertible notes.
Thanks, David. So lots of our clients, when they are looking to raise funds and they're thinking about putting in place a safe, the main other form of fundraising they're often comparing against is a convertible loan. So it's important to kind of analyze these two side by side. So the convertible loan, so similar to the safe, as David's talked about, is an instrument which lets you push that valuation conversation down the road. So the safe or the convertible loan don't in itself put a valuation on the company. However, sometimes these instruments do include a valuation cap. And so a valuation cap will come into play when the safe or the convertible loan converts. So if you do agree to put in a valuation cap, it means that if the safe or the convertible loan is converting as part of a capital raise, if the valuation of your company as part of that raise is more than the valuation cap, then the safe or the convertible loan will convert based on the valuation cap rather than the actual valuation of the company at that time. And so in that way, the safe holder or the convertible loan note holder will get the benefit by being able to convert their instrument at a lower price than the price that the people are buying the shares at in that capital raise round. So as we've got indicated here on the slide, a valuation cap is definitely not required for a safe or a convertible loan. However, they are sometimes included. With regards to negotiation, so as David's talked about, the safe is generally very quick and easy to negotiate. A convertible loan is a little bit more involved than a safe. There's a few more additional terms, and so it can be a slightly longer negotiation. The key terms I'm thinking about here are the term of the loan and interest, whether interest will be payable, and if so, at what rate. So firstly, if we talk about the term of the loan, unlike a SAFE, a convertible loan usually does have a maturity date in that. And so what that means is if you've not raised money, if you've not undertaken a capital raise by the time the maturity date rolls around, the convertible loan will either convert into shares, or you may have the obligation to repay the invested amount, depending on what you've negotiated with the investor and whether the investor has a choice. Secondly, with regards to interest, so interest may be payable on a convertible loan, often it is, but in the company's favour, it's usually not that the company has to make regular interest payments, so it's not like you're having to have make monthly interest payments. Usually the interest amount will accrue and will be added to the invested amount, and then the total amount will convert on the trigger event. So the invested amount plus the accrued interest. So the term, and the interest we've now talked about. Both of those, they won't, so those will be part of your convertible loan, but they usually won't be part of the SAFE. And again, that feeds into why SAFEs are usually a little bit easier to negotiate. In terms of the documents required for the SAFE, there's only the SAFE agreement. For a convertible note, there's usually just a convertible note agreement. And there's note certificates that you'll issue to each investor if you are doing it by way of deed poll, which means the company will sign the deed poll and then it will issue note certificates to each investor that wants to be part of that convertible note round. In terms of regulation, a SAFE is regulated under the Corporations Act as an offer of security. For the convertible note, it's usually regulated as a debt instrument and also under the Corporations Act as an offer of securities. I will now throw to David to talk about the trigger events under SAFEs in more detail.
Thanks, Sian. So one of the conversations you will need to have with investors who aren't necessarily familiar with SAFEs, they will usually ask the question, so I'm giving you my money now, but when do I get my shares, or how am I protected? So there's two main categories of triggering events under a SAFE. One is you raise more capital, usually the way that SAFEs were intended. It's an early stage opportunity to get to your next round. That being said, SAFEs are also used in later rounds too. They're not limited to early stage rounds. Or if we don't raise subsequent capital after the SAFE raise and we get to the final goal, which is an exit, then the SAFEs will also trigger at that point in time. So the SAFE conversion on a qualified financing is usually quite simple to explain. It's once we go out and raise some capital, at that point in time, your SAFEs will trigger into conversion based on the conversion price mechanism, which will depend on whether there is a valuation cap or not. The conversion price at a qualified financing is, from a discount perspective, if we agree to a 20% discount, then the SAFE will convert at a 20% discount to whatever amount raised in your next round. If there's a valuation cap, then it's always drafted so that the investor benefits from the better of the two calculations. So if there's a valuation cap and you run the calculation and it says the price per share for that investor is $8, but you run the discount price and the price would be $1.50, then they're getting the benefit of the dollar price. We have in some later slides included some work examples for your benefit, so it'll help with these calculations, but it is really important that you do set out the whole round in a proper cap table so you can see what each investor and each current shareholder will be affected by. On the exit event, it's generally calculated in the same way, though the valuation of the company is tied to the price paid by the person coming to purchase the company. Whether they're going to purchase the shares of the company from the existing shareholders or whether they're just buying all of the assets, the valuation placed on the company at that point in time will be what's considered the value of the company, and then the discount or valuation cap mechanisms so will be taken into account. So just remembering that the most important thing from an investor's perspective is they want to make sure that they end up with the greatest number of shares that they can possibly get, whether it's the discount price or the valuation cap. And from your perspective as a founder, the consequences of that is because you're issuing a greater number of shares, then you're further diluted. So I'll hand back over to Sian, and she can talk through some of the recent changes we're seeing to safes.
Yeah, thanks, David. So as we've talked about in this presentation so far, traditionally, safes have simply been a right to acquire shares in the business at a later date if a certain trigger event happens, being a capital raise. And traditionally, there hasn't been the obligation to repay that amount or for that amount to convert if a capital raise doesn't happen. However, that is changing, and we are seeing more and more investors request for safes to include a maturity date in it, which means if you haven't raised money, so if there hasn't been a qualifying financing or an exit event by an agreed date, the safe will convert. And so at that point, you obviously haven't gone through a raise or an exit event, so you might not have an external source to tell you what the valuation of the company is at that time. And so to determine what the conversion price will be, it's usually based on the terms that would have been agreed between the investor and the company upfront when they signed the safe. So it might be a price determined by the valuation cap, if there is one, or by another pre-agreed valuation methodology. And so I have these discussions with clients all the time in terms of what an appropriate methodology might be. It's often very hard to look into the future and kind of predict what the company what stage it might be at if a financing has not happened. So often I see companies use potentially multiples of EBITDA or annual recurring revenue or other financial metrics to determine what the value will be for the purposes of calculating how many shares the investor will get if it's converting at the maturity date. Some people also prefer to obtain a price from an independent valuer. Just in consideration of that approach, you need to be mindful that independent valuers can cost money, sometimes quite a lot, and you also don't know what that outcome will be from that valuer. So something to consider before you include that as an option for determining the conversion price if the safe is going to convert at maturity. Also, just because an investor asks for a maturity date, don't instantly accept that position. You need to be mindful and need to consider whether or not you want that safe holder to become a shareholder if you've not reached the trigger event. So if you've not been able to raise money through an equity round, you need to consider what kind of position the company will be in. And it's interesting, like I talk to my clients about this and I see this for them, in some cases they haven't raised money because the company's been going really well and they've been able to survive without the need to raise external funds again. However, in other cases, it might be because the company has not been going so well and so they've not been able to achieve a financing, been able to complete another capital raise. So you need to think in both of those instances, do you want that safe holder coming on as a shareholder? If the answer is no, then you might need to be pushing back on that request to include a maturity date in your safe. Next, David's going to talk about some other changes that we've seen with safes.
Thanks, Sian. Yeah, one of the other, I guess, changes that have come through, which has a commercial impact on you as a founder, is the move from pre-money safes to post-money safes. So traditionally, safes were what's called pre-money safe, which means investors are coming in the safe round, and it doesn't matter how much further money you raise in that round from other safe investors, because the definition of fully diluted capital when we look at the valuation cap and the discount price conversion mechanism doesn't take into account the shares that other safes, when they convert, will be holding. So the benefit of the pre-money safe is you're issuing less shares because they're getting a percentage of a smaller number. And as we said before, every time you issue shares, you're diluted. So the lower number of shares that you issue, the more favorable it is to you. However, from the investor's perspective, there has been somewhat of a push to a post-money safe, because the post-money safe, especially when there's a valuation cap, gives investors the opportunity to have an agreed percentage ownership of the company as part of that safe round. Now, as I said before, we have included some working examples for you to help work through the calculations, and you'll be given a copy of these slides which will benefit you. But it really is important to understand when looking at your safe, if it's not specifically spelled out, whether it's a pre-money or post-money safe. If you look at the definition of fully diluted capital and it excludes the safe and any other safes, it's usually a pre-money safe. If the document is drafted so that it includes the safe and any other safes, then it's usually a post-money safe. If we head across to the next slide, you'll see that the calculation mechanism will generally be the same. It's just the number of shares on issue at the bottom line will be higher, and therefore the price per share will be lower, which means the safe number, the number of shares that safe investors are able to attain goes higher. So I won't walk through in the specific detail of the exact calculation method, but as I said, we have included it. We've included a couple of work examples so that you can run the comparison, but there will obviously normally in a safe round be multiple investors, so it's not as simple as just looking at one person's investment and their impacts on the company. And when we talk about impacts, it's really the founders, if it's an early stage round, or if it's a later stage round, the impact of a pre versus post money will be on the shareholders that already have shares. So I'll hand back to Sian. And
if we can. Thanks, David. Yeah, if we can move through to the next slide, please, and then the next one. So yeah, we have included those worked examples, so you can work through them after the presentation. The next slide. So I'll just talk now just quickly about valuation caps. So traditionally, discount rates and valuation caps are fixed values. So whilst still fairly uncommon, there has been a small uptick in the use of variable discount rates and valuation caps. So this concept involves making the discount rate or the valuation cap more favorable to the investor if the safe does not convert on a set date. So for example, if the safe converts within 1 year, the discount rate might be 20%. So that means if the safe's converting as part of a raise, the safe holder gets to convert its safe at a 20% discount to the share price that the shares are being issued at as part of that raise. But your safe might also include if the safe does not convert within 1 year, then the discount rate will be 25%. So the discount rate has increased the further out we go from when the safe has been signed. So an increasing discount rate reflects two things. So first, it reflects the risk that the safe investors have taken on by investing in your company earlier than the later equity investors. But secondly, it also reflects that if you are converting at a later point in time, the company has probably grown more in value since that point in time. So because of that, again, the safe holder gets a greater discount. So before including, a valuation cap or a variable valuation cap or a variable discount rate, you do need to consider the impact on your existing shareholders. So the higher the discount, the more dilution for your existing shareholders. So that's something you need to think about before agreeing to those terms. And now just to recap, so as we've talked about, safes traditionally, they were one of the easiest instruments to put into place for fundraising purposes, and they are very company friendly traditionally, but they are becoming more complicated. So before agreeing to put in place any of the terms we've discussed, whether it be maturity date, valuation cap, post-money conversion mechanics, please make sure you talk to your lawyer so you can understand the impact on your company and your shareholders. So that concludes the main part of our webinar. You might find our startup manual publication useful. So you can download it either from the handout panel, or you can scan the QR code up on the screen now. We also have an upcoming event that may be of interest to you on sweat equity and helping your startup grow. So that's on Thursday, the 27th of July at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. You can register at that link there on the slide, so legalvision.com.au/events. We will answer your questions very shortly, so if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box. While people are submitting their questions, we'll take you a minute to tell you about our membership. So LegalVision's membership is a cost-effective alternative to have all of your business as usual legal needs covered. For a fixed monthly fee, you not only receive cost certainty, but all-inclusive benefits such as unlimited doc review, which would include reviewing your commercial contracts, unlimited consultations, which means you can book as many meetings with us as you need to discuss any of your business as usual legal needs. You can talk to any of our lawyers, including those from franchising, corporate, employment, intellectual property, etc., depending on your business's needs. Your membership also includes offers for unlimited trademark registration, all for a very reasonable monthly fee, with options to purchase extra credit towards complex matters and capital raising transactions, which are charged on an hourly rates basis. And now we will answer some of your questions. So I will throw to David.
Yeah, look, thanks, Sian. A couple of great questions started to flow through. One of the first questions asked was, do we provide services outside of our 3 jurisdictions, which is Australia, New Zealand, and the UK? The answer is not currently. We provide services in the areas where we are incorporated as legal practitioners allowed to give legal advice. So that's at the moment Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. Though for our members, we do have a range of partners where we often work together to provide services outside of our key jurisdictions. So for those of you who come on a member and do run a true global operation, then we do often have relationships in jurisdictions where we can provide support. It just won't come directly from LegalVision at this stage. Another question that came through is, do safes have preemptive rights? So for those of you who don't know what a preemptive right is, a preemptive right is a protection mechanism for investors that says, if you go and raise future capital, you need to allow me to participate in that raise so that I'm not diluted. So if I hold 5% of the company now, I should be able to take up at least 5% of your next capital raise so that I'm not diluted. The traditional approach with safes is no, it doesn't have that. It's really a protection given to existing shareholders, and because we're trying to keep the document as simple as possible, we don't want to have to negotiate those terms, so they don't sit in there. Though, as we said, safes aren't always as simple, and there can be side letters, specifically for VCs, because this is important for them. They will often want you to grant, if they're not an existing shareholder that has a preemptive right, then they'll often ask for a side letter which gives them a preemptive right. So it won't sit in the safe itself necessarily, but it can be a term that the more savvy or sophisticated investors do try to request. Practically speaking, if the investor doesn't have the ability to oversubscribe, then usually in later rounds, companies go to their existing safe investors and ask them if they want to participate anyway. So it's usually not a right that a lot of founders worry about giving away, but it is one to think about if they are able to oversubscribe, because they could take up the entire round and it means you won't be able to bring on any other investors. One of the other questions that came through was based really on Sian, one of the things Sian spoke about really clearly, which why would a investor want to use a SAFE instead of a convertible note? The question is, it really depends on the type of investor, but a lot of investors you need to remember, especially if they're a fund or a family office, high net worth individuals, they usually have mandates to deploy their capital. To invest in companies. They're not really often guided to go out and lend people money with an option of converting or think about converting. They're really out there to put their money into companies for a long-term investment. So the SAFE and the equity investment are traditionally the avenues they take, and the reason being is a small amount of interest and they repay that and then have to go to redeploy that capital is usually not what they're looking for. They're looking for a long-term relationship, so that's why they prefer SAFEs and equity investment over convertible notes, but that isn't all investors. So the convertible note is another option because it's more of a true debt hybrid where people are looking to lend money with the possibility of taking equity if things look good, then that will be the preferred approach for investors who are really in the business of lending money. Sian, was there any come through that you could see?
Yeah, so yeah, we have a couple more questions here. So one is a question, I think someone just wanted some further clarification on when we say that the agreement is simple for a SAFE, how much simpler is it? So assuming that this is in comparison to a convertible note, it is simpler in that you're not having to agree usually, one, a maturity date and what those conversion mechanics would be on a maturity date, and two, you're not having to negotiate any terms around the interest, so whether interest is payable or if so, what the interest rate is. So the primary things you're going to be negotiating with the SAFE are usually the discount rate. So when the SAFE converts as part of a raise, how much is the discount, how much discount to the share price will the SAFE holder get for the purpose of calculating how many shares it has. Another thing that's often negotiated is the minimum threshold for what will constitute a capital raise. And so what I mean by this is the SAFE, as it's drafted, will convert as part of a capital raise. We usually recommend to our clients to include that the capital raise must be of at least, for example, $1 million or a higher threshold depending on the company, to ensure that the SAFE won't accidentally convert if, say, you're issuing shares to, you know, a founder or a family friend or something that's not really a genuine capital raise. So those two terms are usually the most highly negotiated terms of the SAFE. And so usually a SAFE is about a 10-page document in total. But yeah, as we've said, yeah, very simple usually to negotiate and to put into place. Another question we've had is what type of businesses are we seeing using SAFEs at the moment? So really all kinds of businesses are using SAFEs at the moment. It's really interesting. You know, I think commonly SAFEs were used for much earlier startups, but we are seeing later stage startups use them as well. You know, sometimes often at the moment to avoid down rounds. So a down round is if you've raised capital at a certain valuation, but your company value has since dropped. If you were going to raise capital again at a lower valuation, that would be a down round. And that has impacts on your existing shareholders, particularly if you have preference shareholders in your stack, if you've issued preference shares. And so in those circumstances, we see a lot of businesses using a SAFE round to kind of carry them through and give them a bit more runway in the hope that their company value will increase and they'll be able to raise at a higher valuation in a few more months' time. David, I will throw to you to answer the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Sian. This question that's come through is a good one, especially for those of you who love the mathematics and the calculations involved in capital raising. The question was, in a follow-up round, the SAFE converts into a price based on the fully diluted share capital, how do you calculate fully diluted share capital when there's outstanding safes, because we need to convert those safes as part of the round to determine the price. So without getting too deep into the numbers and scaring everybody with maths, the short answer is really it's somewhat of a simultaneous equation, taking you back to your high school maths days. There's two calculations running on at the same time, which is how many shares are currently on issue, how many shares will be issued in the equity round, and how many shares will be issued to the safe holders. The way that it's calculated is really to determine, well, what is the amount to issue to safes, assuming that the share price for the round is based on, depending on whether it's a pre or post money safe, the formula of calculating how many shares are on issue immediately before the round. And then once the safes convert, the follow-on capital raising round is issued on the assumption that the safes have been converted. So I think the easiest way to think about the follow-on round is the safe conversion happens immediately before the round completes. So even though they're all tied up together, for the calculation purposes, we run the safe conversion, and that converts based on the round price, and then those shares are issued, and immediately after, there's now more shares on issue. Investors calculate the fully diluted capital for the purpose of their investment, and then their round closes, and that therefore the safe investors are diluted by the follow-on round. One of the other questions that came through here is, how do we determine if a safe is pre or post money? So in the slides provided today, and you'll be able to go back to them because you'll get a copy after this, it's important to look at the definition of fully diluted capital. If it includes the safes and all the other safes in the round, it's a post-money safe. If it doesn't include all the other safes, then it's a pre-money safe. So that's the place to look. If you're dealing with VCs, they will usually send a term sheet to you, and sometimes the term sheet will say we're offering you a pre or post-money safe, and it'll be much clearer. If you're not dealing with VCs, then sometimes the expectation is you will put it forward, so you'll need to make clear whether you're offering a pre-money or a post-money safe, and you put forward the documentation.
David, we have a couple more. So someone has a question, if they are using LegalVision, who pays our fees for putting in place the safe, the startup or the investor? So usually industry practice is, and this is consistent across all law firms, it's what is negotiated between the company and the investor. But usually the company pays the legal fees of both the company and the investor. But if that is the case, usually you can agree a cap in terms of you'll pay the legal investor fees up to this amount, and the investor's usually required to give you a quote. But depending how friendly you are with the investors, they might be happy to wear the legal costs. For LegalVision, in terms of our billing, we will only bill you once the round completes. And so you can at least wait to get the money in the door first, and then pay the legal fees for putting in place the next question was, how often are safes accepted in Australia by local investors versus convertible notes? They say, I've heard Australian investors are less likely to accept safes and would prefer convertible notes. Is that still true? So I guess at least what we're seeing in the market is safes is still very, very popular. So our view is that investors are still happy to proceed with a safe, because they're happy again to get that money into the company, and see if that company will grow and be able to make a success of itself. So generally, depending on the people who you are speaking to, they're generally not in the practice of earning interest on investments. That's not why they're investing in early stage companies. They're investing to see that company increase in value and get the yield from the increase in value of the company rather than being paid interest. So I think for that reason, safes are still pretty popular among Australian investors at this time. Then I will throw to David for the next question.
Yeah, I think we've got time for this last question, and I think it's the perfect question. It was a bit of a follow-up to the question about how simple is a safe. The question being, safe is simple, but the shareholders agreement, board agreement are not. Can we elaborate? So I think the first few slides we set out some of the key differences between a safe round and an equity round, and Sian touched briefly on some of the document sizes. Remembering the safe has 2 or 3 moving parts that are negotiated in a 10-page document from close to finish. Once the document's signed, there's nothing further to do. An equity round, in comparison, the subscription agreement has 4 or 5 moving parts, and it's usually, depending on how many warranties the company has to give, can be a 20-page document. The shareholders agreement probably has 20 or 30 moving parts. We're talking about preemptive rights, co-sale rights, vesting for shareholders, the mechanism of exit and who controls decision making, who gets board seats, and it's often a 50 page document. So the scale of negotiations as a result are just much higher. So the process is, in terms of chalk and cheese, on what's simple and what's not. That being said, equity rounds aren't overly complicated and go on forever. There is standardized documents which everyone uses as a base, but unlike SAFE, which are a truly standard document where the mechanics of the document aren't really negotiated, it's just the commercial application. Shareholders agreements and subscription agreements are less standardized, and they are more open to negotiation. So the way to look at it is the SAFE, you sign it, there's not much more to do. The equity investment, you need to negotiate all the moving parts. Then once you sign all the documents, there's steps that you need to put in place. You have to update your registers, you need to update ASIC, you need to issue share certificates. There might be things that the company has to do, like put in place IP assignments and new contracts with the founders. And there can be a lot more involved because investors are taking the view, once they come on as a shareholder, they want everything to be. Whereas the SAFE is saying, we know we will be an investor, we will be a shareholder in the future, but we can worry about all those things. So let's keep it simple for now. So I hope that really sort of answers the question on the difference between how simple a SAFE is compared to equity rounds. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah. And after the webinar ends, a survey will pop up. So we would really appreciate it if you could complete the 30-second survey. And please remember to include your contact details to receive a complimentary legal consultation to discuss how we can help you with your startup. Thank you all.